Our next presenter is Charlotte Reemts, is an ecologist and science project director with the Nature Conservancy Texas chapter, where she has studied ecosystems across Texas for 19 years, both in natural areas and on working lands. Charlotte?
All right, we'll see if I can stay glued to this microphone so everybody can hear me. I tend to wander. My name is the only one up on the screen, but I do want to acknowledge I'm not the one who did all of this work or collected all of this data. There's been teams and teams of seasonal field biologists at the military base I'll be talking about who collected, and then Carla Piconich, who's a natural resource specialist there, and Jennifer Reedy from University of Missouri are also integral to this project. The other thing that I would like to acknowledge is that Indigenous peoples have managed the lands that we are meeting on and the lands that I'll be talking about today since time immemorial. And fire, we know, in many parts of North America was a really, really important management tool, and it continues to be an important management tool at the Leon River Medicine Wheel, which is on the site that I'll be talking about today. Devin, coming after me, is going to talk a little bit more about savanna, but just fire ecology 101, so this is like fire ecology in 3 slides. When you have frequent fire, you tend to end up with grassland or savanna. When you have less frequent fire, you tend to end up with denser woodland or forest. And plants kind of have 2 main strategies that they recover after a fire. One is that if they're top killed, many plants can resprout. So here's a Texas red oak that's resprouting from its base after being burned, and there's many, many other plants that can do that. And then there's other plants that don't resprout. So in our ecosystem today, Ashe-juniper is that plant. They rely on reseeding into an area, either coming up from the seed bank or having seed rain. So the area that I'm talking about today, or the study site, is Fort Cavazos. It used to be called Fort Hood, just got renamed. And it's this really interesting place in the state. It's at the boundary of the Edwards Plateau and Cross Timbers ecoregions. So when Dave was talking this morning about all those different ecological sites, like we're sort of at the edge of a lot of that, but there's a lot of similarities to this little area, which is often called the Lampasas Cup Plain. A lot of similarities between that and the hill country, and so you'll see that. This is also an interesting place because, like in a lot of the hill country, we have both golden cheek warblers, which need mature oak-juniper woodlands, and we also have black-capped vireos, which need relatively early successional shrublands. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition of habitats. During the presentation today, I'll be talking about 3 main habitat types, or 3 kind of topographic locations. So we have the mesa tops. The Lampasas Cut Plains has like these very flat mesas, sort of like you imagine, like, you know, the Wild West, New Mexico kind of flat. This is what these ones are like. We have slopes, and then what I'm calling the deep soils. They're only deep in comparison to the other 2, but they are the valley bottom soils. They're a little bit deeper. And so we'll refer to those 3 soil types. If you want to ask me afterwards, I have the exact soil names. But those don't mean anything to most people. But just a little tour through the 3 sites. So the mesa tops, the soils are generally extremely shallow, lots of bedrock outcrops. The main oak species we have up here is shin oak, Quercus sinuata. On the slopes, we have the Texas red oak. Somebody picked up on in Jason's presentation, there was a little outlier of big tooth maple. That's where the big tooth maples are here at Fort Cavazos. So the dominant oak is Texas red oak, but there's also Shinkopan oak, and in the really deep canyons, we have some lost maples that got lost a little farther north than everybody else. So like this is really, really analogous to a lot of the hill country slopes. So if that's what you really care about, keep an eye on this. And then the deep soils, these are the redland soils. This is where we see a lot of that cross timbers influence, where we have post oaks, blackjack oaks. These probably should be savannas, but the sites that I'll be talking about had not had really any management. And so now they're kind of post oak, Ashe-juniper woodlands. And I'm the first three of the fire talks for this afternoon, so I get to show you the first really cool fire picture. Although it was not so cool for the people who are dealing with the two wildfires that I'll be talking about today. So the first fire was started by military training activities in February 1996. It was an exceptionally hot February. They had multiple days fighting the fire at 90 degrees. It jumped a 4-lane highway, so like really extreme conditions. Burned almost 10,000 acres of woodland. And then in April 2009, there was a much smaller fire also started by military training activities, because this is an active military base. When you shoot incendiary devices, things catch on fire. Sometimes the fire doesn't stay where you want it to. And that April fire reburned parts of the 1996 fire. And just to help orient you a little bit to the scale, fire is messy. It doesn't burn in nice, neat squares. So this is zoomed in on one little part. So let me turn this way. So the red outline is the second fire. The pink outline is the first fire. The white dots are all the places where we collected information. This is aerial imagery from the winter. So all of the deciduous trees don't have leaves on them. So it means where you see the dark green, maybe it looks like black from out there, that's where we have our ash juniper. Those are the unburned areas. And then this lighter stuff is all burned. So we don't have data from before things burned, but you can see that the burned and the unburned things are right next to each other. They're on the same soil type. So we're assuming that the burned areas before they burned looked very much like the unburned areas. And then this is what the whole thing looked like. So you can see the 96 fire was quite extensive, but not all completely contiguous. And so we have some twice burned things. We have once burned things down here. We have once burned and unburned things up there, and then some more unburned things, and the lost maples are kind of over there. All right, and these fires, because they burned under really extreme conditions, are not the kinds of fires that we like to do when we do prescribed burns. These burned as crown fires, and this is what it looked like after the fire. So that's pretty devastating. In the areas where we sampled, there literally was not any stem that was not top killed. When I went out after the second fire, I had my data sheets all set up to like capture the surviving stems and the reburned, and there were no surviving stems, which made the data collection easier. But this is a photo taken a couple weeks after the second fire. So even though when you look sort of across the top of the landscape, it looks really bad, even within a couple weeks, we already have trees that are resprouting. So these are trees in their ecological evolutionary history. This is not the first time that they've experienced fire. So in a minute, I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs, but before I do that, I'm going to show you a bunch of photos that are basically going to walk you through a sequence of what these places looked like as they recovered from fire. So again, the unburned mesa tops, very flat, shallow soil, shin oak. This is what they looked like after the fire. All of these fires are taken in the summer. The first few pictures look a little weird because they're scanned slides. Then we get to like great digital cameras, and then they burned again, which was not so great. But just going from, so this was an April fire, this was May, this was June. It doesn't take a long time for these plants to start to recover. And then 2020 is the most recent data that we have. So that's what the mesa tops look like. So same thing for the slope. This is where mostly we have our Texas red oaks. This is not the slopiest of slope sites because otherwise you couldn't see anything, but it really doesn't take very long for those trees to get quite tall. And then they all burn down again, and then they start regrowing again, and they got tall really quickly. All right, so getting to the graphs. So the first series of graphs I'm going to show you are all the species except ash juniper. So generally these are all things that resprout. We're going to talk about understory density, which is all your small stuff, so things less than 5 centimeters or 2 inches in diameter. We'll talk about trees in a minute. I'll have separate graphs for the mesas and the slopes, because sometimes they respond a little bit differently. And I'll have always the data from the unburned sites just for comparison, so you can kind of see how does this recovery compare to where we think these places started. And because I pull these graphs from a publication that's under review, all the axes are in metric, but if you think in imperial units, I'll have some sort of a reference. So like if you think of stems in stems per acre, that's your reference. All right, so resprouting plants resprout a lot, relatively quickly, and particularly after the second fire, we saw way more stems after the second fire than we did after the first fire. And I think that's because at the time of the second fire, most of the plants were smaller. And a lot of trees, their ability to resprout kind of decreases slowly as they get bigger, so smaller plants resprout better. We see kind of a peak in density after the first fire around 9 years, and then it's not that the stems are going away, it's that they're getting bigger and they're going into the tree class. The second fire, it decreases, so by about a decade after the fire, they're pretty similar. And we end up with roughly the same number of stems that we did in unburned areas. Whoops. Yeah, and so again, just like this is what it looked like in 1996, 2009. Like visually, there's not a huge difference, but you get in there and count those clumps, there's a lot. And basically, we see almost exactly the same pattern on the slopes. So kind of a peak around a decade after the fire, many, many more stems after the second fire. All right, so then if we look at tree density, so this is all the things bigger than 5 centimeters dBH. Remember I said we had that peak around 10 years and then it went down? Well, that's because that's when you start getting things moving into this tree size class. And very quickly, we actually have more stems than we did before the fire. It looks maybe like the recovery's a little bit slower in the second fire. It's not really a statistical difference, so we'll need a couple more years, a couple more decades to see if that's true. Basically the same pattern on the slopes, although the density recovers a little bit more quickly. They have a little bit more moisture, so things just grow faster. Another way to look at a woodland is not just count how many individual stems there are, but also how big they are. So basal areas, basically, if you pretended every single stem was round in a circle and you measured it in either square meters or feet and you added all those up, that's what your basal area is for a forest. And what we see is that the basal area, we end up with a basal area that's relatively similar to the unburned areas, but remember our tree density was higher. And so what this is telling us is that we have more stems, but all the stems are smaller, which isn't really surprising because when you take an area that had no clearing or disturbance since at least the 1920s, which is the earliest aerial imagery we have, so you had big trees, you burned them all down, they're not going to be big trees in 25 years. And again, just this is what one of those slope sites look like. So you can see there's a lot of stems there, but you can see that they're kind of small and bushy. All right, so far I've talked about the mesas and the slopes. The reason I haven't talked about the deep soils yet is that none of those burned twice, but I want to show you what those look like in case you're thinking about post-oak management. So we'll do the same kind of photo series. You can see these were relatively big trees before the fire, and then they just keep getting bigger and recovering. And so this is what it looks like in 2020. So if you were aiming for a savanna, this is not exactly what you're going for. So just one crown fire is not going to take an oak-juniper woodland and make it a savanna. There's probably a little bit more that you need to do in there. So this is the same understory graph that you saw before, the mesas and the slopes. And we see basically the same pattern on the deep soils. You get a peak maybe slightly earlier. These soils are a little bit deeper. If you look at tree density, basically the same pattern. Because these are savannas or encroached savannas, you have a much bigger error bar because your tree density is just much more variable. Same thing with basal area. So the deep soils are, all basically no matter where you are on the landscape, your recovery looks relatively similar. But there's something missing that I haven't talked about yet. So if you know your Central Texas plants, you might be able to pick out there's some flameleaf sumac, there's some Chinook, there's a field ecologist. But there's something missing, like all this dark green stuff is the juniper. So what happened to all of the juniper? So let me show you the data from that. And the answer is juniper recovers really not well after crown fire. So this is understory stem density. There are basically, like literally no junipers for about the first decade. And then after that, you get like a teeny tiny handful number of junipers. Same thing with the tree. After the second fire, there are no juniper trees anywhere in that second fire, and a teeny tiny number of juniper trees after the first fire. So like those of us who manage grasslands, like we're burning every 3 to 5 years to keep the juniper out. Now we're like 25 years and there's a handful of junipers. Like what's going on here? So one of the things I think happened is that the seed bank was destroyed. These fires were hot enough that they burned down into the mineral soil. They burned up all that duff, all that litter layer that we've been hearing about all morning, all the seeds that are in there totally burned up. So there's no local source for the juniper to come in from. Another thing is that these fires were really big. Like you can stand at this spot in the landscape and look across the valley down to the next mesa, and there's not a single juniper in sight. You know, juniper, it's dispersed by animals. Rich showed us all the different animals and birds that eat it, but when you're animal dispersed, your seed distribution's very clumpy. It's not that like if we were reseeding an area where you would have like a nice even distribution of the seeds. So it's hard for the seeds to reach any particular spot. And I did actually look to see if there was a relationship between juniper and the distance from fire. And so what I did for each one of these points is I measured how far is it from that point to the edge of the fire. So on the x-axis here, like 0 is right at the edge of the fire and 600 is like really far into the fire. And we see that there's maybe a relationship. It's particularly strong here on our deep soils, but generally you do seem to get a few more junipers closer to the edge. So there's definitely a dispersal effect going on. There's also a lot of competition from these resprouting oaks. So if you know juniper seedlings, they're about that big. And if you're competing with something that can get 6 feet tall in a growing season because it has all these underground resources, it's just really hard for the junipers to handle this. So what does this mean for the two species, the warblers and the vireos? And obviously there's more than just 2 species that we care about, but we'll talk about these two. So crown fire creates blackcat vireo habitat. You can see the tree skeletons from before, but vireos generally like short vegetation, 6-ish feet or under. And particularly on the mesas, when the soils are really shallow and things grow back slowly, this makes vireo habitat for quite a long time. So the vireos are like, cool, thanks for the fire. We can take some more of that. And the warblers have to go somewhere else. And after the 96 fire, because it happened in February, it happened right before all the warblers came back. A bunch of them came back to what had been their territories. They sat on the tops of the tree skeletons, sang a few times, they're like, what am I doing here? And flew off to find some other place. So couple of conclusions. Our hardwoods are resilient to multiple crown fires. Becca unfortunately couldn't be here today. She would have told you all kinds of really interesting things about deer browsing, and you can ask me about deer browsing afterwards at the happy hour. But we clearly had no problem with tree regeneration, and that's because there's not that many deer on this site. It's big enough, there's still mountain lions. And then ash juniper recolonized these areas really slowly. So if we have places with really, really large mature junipers, they're probably decades or hundreds of years without crown fire. Surface fire is a whole different thing. And that's what I have. And I think Todd's going to kick me off the stage now. Okay. All right.
Since our next presenter, Rebecca, is not going to be able to join us today, we do have a few extra minutes for some questions. So we'll take questions from the audience. If you wouldn't mind reading or re-expunging what was going. Yes, sir.
All right, Bill. Yeah, so the question was like, when we see this huge increase in the number of stems, is it one individual, what had been one individual maybe with a couple stems that now has 50 stems, or are we actually getting new individuals? So we did not keep track of that when we were collecting the data, because particularly for Chinook, it makes these big mottes, and so it's really hard to tell what is an individual. But we really did not see a whole lot of brand new regeneration. There probably was some in there when you get like 600 stems of poison ivy in a 5x5 area, like things start to blur together a little bit. But really it mostly seemed like we were primarily taking the individuals that were there, top killing them and just having them regenerate. Yes. Yeah, so the question was, do the oak species really differ in their resilience to fire? I dug into this a little bit. It did seem like the post oaks resprouted maybe a little bit less than the others. And again, I think that's because they were the biggest trees at the time of the fire. There's some evidence in the literature, again, that trees start to lose their ability to resprout as they get big. They just kind of grow over those basal meristem buds. But not a big enough difference that I would really worry about that in terms of, not that you would want to manage a site necessarily with crown fire unless you're managing for vireo habitat. But yeah, not a huge difference among the oak species. Yes. Yeah, so the question was if we're seeing any trees dying in the control plots because they just sort of seem to get to a certain age. You know, I would have to go back and look like at a plot by plot level to see like how many red oaks we used to have and how many red oaks we have now. There's oak wilt out here, none of it that's like super prevalent on our study areas. I don't remember seeing a lot of like really obvious oak death out there, but I have the information to answer that question, and I will go do that. Yeah, so the question was if the existence of old growth juniper is evidence that there used to not be crown fire in this area. I think it is evidence that there has not been crown fire in that place for a very long time. I think the presence of black-cat vireos in this part of the state suggests that there probably has been crown fire because in the absence of really active management, you know, if we took all of us out of the areas where we're managing black-cat vireos, the habitat goes away. And really the way that I think historically that habitat would have been created would have been through crown fires. I don't necessarily see native peoples going around and like chopping down a bunch of trees to make shrubland. I mean, maybe they did that as part of other activities and they would have created some shrubland, but I don't think you could have created enough shrubland to have black-cat vireo without crown fires. It doesn't mean that the fires were, 10,000 acres at a time. Like that was a really unusual situation. But probably there were places in the landscape where we had these fires, but not necessarily very often, because otherwise we wouldn't have these really large junipers. So the question was, like, there's reports of passenger pigeons landing in Chinneries and like, there's so many birds, they squash it out. I haven't read those. unless they are breaking all the stems, like those stems would just kind of stand back up. I mean, Chinook's I've crawled through a bunch of Chinook. It's relatively flexible. Like it takes quite a lot to actually break those stems down. So, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. You know, it's interesting to think about passenger pigeons as a dispersal agent for juniper, because if we did have relatively large crown fires, like how would the juniper have gotten back in? And, you know, I imagine a passenger pigeon flock would be a much better dispersal agent than a flock of cedar waxwings. All right, thank you.